The Why Didn't You Test That podcast want to improve your software. The team at Curiosity and their guests share experiences and insight on the many sides of better software delivery.
Hello everybody and welcome back to the next in the series of the Why Didn't You Test That pod. I'm Rich Jordan and joining me today as co-presenter we have James Walker. James, if you want to quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. Been a long time coming, waiting to come on here. So I guess for those of you who don't know me, my name's James Walker. I'm currently the CEO of Curiosity Software. I guess I've spent the past 10 years predominantly focusing on model-based testing and now enterprise test data as well. So yeah, pretty excited to be here with you, Rich, and obviously Colin as well.
Cool. So you've given a little teaser there. Our guest for today is Colin Hammond. So we're going to be talking a lot about requirements and exploring the challenges and obstacles to overcome around requirements. I'll just read out a quick intro to Colin before introducing the man himself. So Colin's career spans 30 years in IT and is a software sizing innovator and CEO of ScopeMaster, where the company created the world's first commercial requirements analyzer. The tool ScopeMaster uses natural language processing, a branch of AI, to automate requirements analysis, QA, and sizing. Colin is also the co-author of Lamfind.com, an automated daily service for checking on people who live alone. All this is underpinned by Colin's passion for using intelligent metrics and quality techniques to enable software managers to deliver better software faster, cheaper, and with less risk. His extensive experience in managing and delivering projects and portfolios for large organizations employs using Agile project management. More personally, Colin is certified function point specialist, a professional member of the Chartered Institute for IT, and is a certified cosmic functional sizing practitioner, Prince 2 certified, and have a master's degree in engineering. What an introduction. Hello, Colin. Welcome to the pod.
Hello. Thank you. Wow. That's a long list.
I've done my research. So to get us going, obviously you're the CEO of ScopeMaster. Do you want to give us a bit of an introduction into what ScopeMaster does and some of the kind of the regular engagement you get involved within?
Yeah, sure. I'm a lifelong learner, so probably why there's so many things on that list. And one of the things that myself and my colleagues learnt during the course of it's nearly 3 decades of running other people's software projects is a poor recognition of the importance of size and a consistently poor standard of requirements quality. And the combination of those leads to projects heading in the wrong direction. What surprised me learning about sizing was how early you could detect whether a project was doing the right things or not. And as a project and portfolio manager, that was really important for me to know. So about 5 years ago, we started looking at requirements text to see if we could automate the sizing and at the same time maybe have a go at quality assurance of them. And so the journey of ScopeMaster has been a fairly long one in the software world. So we're now on year 5, and we've analysed over 1 million requirements now for getting on for 100 organisations, all sorts of projects that they're doing. And the value of doing good requirements work, requirements quality assurance, and knowing the size is amazing. I mean, because so much money is spent on software development and testing, and usually on the larger projects, it's those extended testing and retesting periods that kill the project or make it go over budget. So if a large proportion of the root cause of those problems is the requirements themselves, we can nip that in the bud by exposing some of those problems early.
When would you typically get involved or engage with a typical customer? Is it kind of when it's gone wrong, or you get the opportunity to work with customers to do it right up front?
So the role of the tool that we've created is about getting better requirements early on. Yeah. So we work at a particular level of granularity. It's as the requirements are emerging. That's when ScopeMaster can analyze your backlog, refine it, and accelerate refining it so that you end up with a really good initial set of requirements, and that's its sweet spot.
Yeah.
Now, most organizations, when they come to us, they recognize that they have a problem. There are different problems that they come with. One of which is software estimation. Our projects seem to be costing more than we ever expected. How do we estimate more effectively? So that's one, if you like, use case. Another one is system integrators responding to bids, and they want to accelerate their bid response process. But at the same time, giving insight back to the client to say, look, well, we've examined your requirements and here's what we think, and use the output of ScopeMaster to impress the clients and hopefully for them to win the business. And then on the other side of the coin, there are companies buying software development services who are not sure whether or not they're being treated fairly by their software vendors, their development and testing vendors, and they're keen to use the sizing to help get there. The interesting thing there is that it usually reveals problems in their own requirements, which can be a little. In fact, there's a lot of what ScopeMaster does is reveal some embarrassing shortfalls in requirements quality.
Question for James then. Colin mentioned there around engagements when customers recognise there is a problem with requirements. What's your experience? And we're coming from more of a testing lens rather than a kind of a requirements and a project management lens. What's your kind of experience around organisations that appreciate they have got a challenge when it comes to requirements?
But I mean, from my perspective, with a testing lens, more often than not, things just get thrown over the wall, right? We've ended up in this situation where we have a piece of software in front of us, we have the textual based requirements in front of us, and now our job is to kind of go out and say, how can we map these requirements to the software and come up with this test suite that exists? And I think what we've seen in organizations is, the quality of the requirements, which I think Colin's probably going to touch on, is incredibly poor. What gets thrown over the wall, sometimes it's literally a user story with no text in, right? And then you've got this tester there who has to go through, talk to all the stakeholders, try and reverse engineer what the business value of this requirement was meant to be in the first place. And that takes time, right? Getting together, trying to understand the requirement. And 9 times out of 10, the information is so dispersed, it just takes so much time to get there. And that just slows down everything like so much later than it should be. Like I'm a big fan of how can we do things earlier and how can we do things so that we set ourselves up for success. And I think the biggest thing we see in organizations is every single company in some shape or form ends up setting themselves up to fail from the beginning. And that's kind of a challenge, right? I don't know if you see a similar thing there, Colin, or what your experience is.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes there's even pushback when you say, look, guys, we've assessed the requirements, or maybe somebody internally has said, look, we've assessed the requirements on this project, and they're really poor. And yet there's still a momentum for, well, never mind that, we've got to start writing code. And there's almost this sort of blindness by senior folks on projects, or those governing the projects. There's a blindness to the importance of requirements quality, or there'll be pushback and say, well, oh no, our requirements are fine, we have domain knowledge, we know what we're doing, everything will be fine. But I guess the other thing is that this happens more and more these days is agile teams who are enthusiastic about writing code and testing software are less bothered about whether or not it's the wrong thing. They're more worried about doing work. And so there's a little bit of pushback on anything that oversees requirements quality.
You've kind of alluded there in terms of one of the questions I was thinking of in terms of, almost has that problem ramped up since the kind of the broader adoption of Agile? And I think the answer to that is yes. Do you think it's more, you've got the kind of Agile manifesto and kind of the principles around, working code over documentation. Do you think that there is a problem in the way that requirements are perceived as a piece of documentation rather than a mechanism or a journey to understanding how a system should work?
The Agile manifesto is sort of everybody's go-to piece of text on how we should write software. And I try to think of it as this. It's fast feedback. The Agile manifesto is all about getting fast feedback. And essentially, it was like write some requirements, write some code, show it to the customer, get some fast feedback, and move accordingly, adapt accordingly. And it's that fast feedback concept which Agile is all about. And I think people have got so carried away with, oh no, Agile is about continuous integration and continuous development and all that. Well, those are consequences of the fast feedback. And we look at requirements and say, well, how do we get fast feedback on the requirements? Because you still need to understand what needs to be delivered. And so we consider ScopeMaster as a tool that gives you fast feedback on requirements, and in that sense is very Agile friendly, because the fast feedback loops is really what it's all about. Some of the things that we said already is that people are so slavish, so slavily adhering to the Agile manifesto. And it ends up with a little bit of, no, we don't need your stinking requirements. We're just going to get on and we've had a conversation. We're going to start writing code. So I'm kind of sort of over dramatizing it a little bit there, but there are a lot of people doing software development really well. And I think you will find most of them do pay good attention to requirements. Studies from the late 80s and early 90s showed that projects that spent at least 15% of their budget on requirements ended up with the shortest schedules. So you spend less than 50, and with higher levels of reuse, code reuse and low code tools, actually that proportion of the budget should go up, not down. So we should be looking towards 20-25% of the budget of an entire project should be on the requirements, because then you're just configuring and assembling, tools and code reuse.
So do you see many organizations that still work in a more traditional waterfall model? I hate to I don't want to give a negative connotation on this, but kind of, your 3-month block of requirements that kind of are created in a silo and then chucked over the fence. Do you still see a lot of that?
Yeah.
Or, you mentioned you engage with a lot of people that kind of are making mistakes. I guess there's the agile mistakes, and then there's the kind of the traditional ones that were there for a longer time.
At a high level, you need to know what most of the features are before you even start. At a high level, not at the detail. So let's say you should know all the epics, if you like. You should know all the epics before you start, because if you don't, you're actually starting something that could be endless, and never to deliver. So certainly there will be technical challenges, and then there will be missing functional requirements along the way, but those should be relatively small. We talk about we talk about the knowns, the knowable unknowns, and the unknowable unknowns at the start. And most people who are probably just jumping into coding will say, well, we don't know about that stuff yet, and we're learning as we go. I keep hearing that expression, we're learning as we go, which is sometimes true, and sometimes is just, well, we were too lazy to do the requirements properly. Had we done the requirements properly, we would have known that this was going to be a £3 or £5 million project instead of a £1 million project, which is what we originally estimated.
Because if you look at other industries, this just wouldn't fly. Like if you were going out and building a house, building a skyscraper, anything with construction involved, right? It's all about, let's get our architecture diagrams up front. You would never have a bunch of builders turning up on site, creating all this stuff without all of that stuff being in place, right? But in the software development industry, it's almost become the norm that you can kind of wing it and just code and see where you end up, which seems kind of absurd, as you say, Colin, for these huge, enormously funded projects where you should have kind of all your ducks in a row before you get going.
I think it's an interesting point there, right? In terms of, if you look at kind of DevOps and, they will promote experimentation, right? And I think there's the perception that IT systems writing code is quite cheap. To your example around building something physical, but I think, does that really sit when we've talked about actually the cost of not doing requirements up front early doors? There's a hell of a lot of cost that is going to come later in that project, right? And I think the perception that IT is cheap, you can prototype cheap in IT, that's good in the small, but I think it ignores large organizations, combinatorial explosions, to a certain extent, there's still a siloed mentality in terms of, yeah, it's cheap for me, but I can chuck it over the fence. And by the time I chuck it over the fence, it's not my problem then. And I think that there's a big problem there in terms of really understanding the cost of IT change. And actually, it might be better to go slower up front, articulate what those requirements should be, and things that we don't know up front, to spend a bit more time doing analysis to make them a little more known, and then go and execute in the real subsequently after we know a bit more of that. It's going to be a hell of a lot more faster, in my opinion.
I agree. I mean, there's a question here, I guess, Colin, which is, do you see this differing between different industries? Because I guess in the finance world, in theory, it's highly regulated. The cost of and the impact of something going wrong is in theory ginormous, right? Especially if you're in, back end enterprise systems where we're running payroll, or, we're running settlement systems, etc. Do you see this requirement challenge still happening in those kind of industries, or are you seeing a different kind of area, I guess?
Yeah, I do still see the problem, and one of which is neglecting the skills and training of people writing requirements. And when I say write them, I really mean elicit them and then document them, or then articulate them, because discovering the requirements is the hard part. What are the real requirements? They say anybody can write them down, but actually finding out what the real ones are, knowing who to go to, what questions to ask, how to ask the right questions, how to discover what really matters. Those and bang on people's doors. Those are the skills that are probably not trained enough. I know of one organization that has 50 business analysts, and when I asked them, what is your qualification standard for your business analysts? And the answer was, well, so long as they've done some work in that area before, that's okay for us. This is a financial organization. And they wonder why they're having problems. So there is also, I think, a failure to appreciate the importance of knowing the requirements, or at least at a high level, early, so that you get the architecture right. So the experimentation bit, I do support that, because especially for systems of engagement, not so much in the finance industry, unless you're writing, an app to make, an app on a phone, and you want to make it as fun and engaging and gamified or whatever it might be. That justifies experimentation about the UI and how how engaging that might be. But under the hood, the transactions that need to take place are known or knowable early doors, and you've got to get those absolutely right. And because you know those, it's important to get them articulated even at a high level, so that you get the architecture right, because architectural defects are really costly to change later, as are requirements defects. But if you get the architecture wrong, then all your start small and experiment, all that will have to get thrown out and restart. So you need a high level understanding of all the requirements in order to get the architecture right. That will also give you an early indication of size, which will facilitate grown-up conversations about scope. What can we afford to do? What should we do? What's the most valuable? This is obviously too big for what we want to do, or what we can afford. So how do we adjust the scope? But if you've had those high-level investigations about requirements, you'll get your architecture right. You may even also spot the technical risk areas. So we did a project for a supermarket once. It was many millions of pounds, and there was one area of technical uncertainty. And we spent a lot of time and money diving into alternative technical solutions for that. But the rest of the whole project was knowable up front. So we had some experimentation about that technical risk, and quite substantial experimentation. And then the rest of the project was completely knowable, and we could just follow a predictable series of steps to get it delivered. And I'm very proud we high quality people doing high quality work. So I don't know where I was, why I was on the team.
Was that piece of work centered around cosmic function points?
No, but we did use sizing in pockets to make informed decisions. So, for example, there was some batch processes that came to about 100,000 lines of SQL. And we took some grown-up decisions based on the site. I mean, you could just measure the number of lines of SQL. That was enough to scare people into making no changes. But we could have also, for example, it was a migration project, and we could have taken the view that, oh, well, as we spot bugs, let's fix them. And the conclusion was, no, it's too big to do that. 100,000 lines of SQL is about 4,000 function points, and if you were to try and change those during the course of the project, you would have, we had to deliver it in a year, and that would have taken an extra year, so probably more.
Just for the people listening, then, would you mind taking a slight step back and then just explaining kind of function point? I'm going to say function point analysis and cosmic function point sizing. Are they the same thing or are they different? Just if you wouldn't mind explaining,
yeah, sure,
kind of the whole sphere of that.
Sure. So sizing software is difficult, but like with any engineering project, knowing the size can be useful. And the size can determine the cost, the duration, how many tests you're going to need, all sorts of things. And I discovered this almost sort of in the latter part of my project management experience. It was introduced to me, and I didn't believe it. I was quite reluctant. Was quite a slow learner, really, but I was shown how useful it would be in terms of: are we doing the right things? Have we got enough people? Is our productivity going to get us to where we need to be? Are we doing enough testing? All those questions that you need to be able to answer as a project manager could be answered quite reliably if you knew the functional size. So historically, people would just measure lines of code or count the lines of code. There's all sorts of reasons why that doesn't work. So back in the 1970s, a guy came up with this idea of functional sizing, and then several standards emerged over the following years. And the second generation standard is called cosmic sizing. And it's pretty agile friendly because you can size an individual user story. And so users, and it's in short, it's the sum of the entries, exits, reads, and writes. And that can be measured at different levels of granularity and different scopes. So you can decide what you're going to measure. So you could measure an operating system, you could measure an embedded system, you could measure an application, or even an increment, or right down to a user story. Those can all be measured using the cosmic sizing, which is an ISO standard, and it's free, and you can learn it in a couple of weeks. So I highly recommend it. And as a project manager, knowing the size is just so useful.
I guess I'm no expert by any means, as you can tell from my questions, but I guess in my previous role, I was a bit of a hobbyist, and like yourself, I guess the whole ability to measure something intrigued me, right? So I led a testing capability that had an SI, and therefore, to the point you've already raised, it had an element of how do you make sure that the SI is kind of doing things at the right size, at the right cost, at the right speed. We were actually trying to test infrastructure. All right, and infrastructure, with the greatest will in the world, is a bit of a black box to most people in the organization, especially testers, especially designers. It will talk about, well, can we spin up a Linux box, for example, right? The big challenge around that is actually how do you configure said infrastructure, right? And so we were already doing modeling, and so we thought, right, actually, can we standardize down on the configurations and then start using function points to understand how complex is a Linux server versus a Windows server, for example? And then when we want to upgrade to the next version, can we use function points to understand how more complex a operating system has got from the previous version to the next version? Then can we use function points to understand how long should that SI take to prove something of a certain complexity, and if it increases in complexity, how can I understand how much effort and how that corresponds to estimates that they give us, and therefore the cost. I found it really very useful, right? And Were we following the standard? I don't know, probably not. But even the kind of the scratching the surface that we did, we found it really powerful, right, in terms of understanding the work we did, how to get continual improvement out of what we were doing, but also how to articulate out the kind of the complexity, the risk, the cost of different things that we were doing. I'm assuming that's the kind of the light bulb moment that you were describing, that most organizations who start adopting this, they're kind of getting that, right?
Well, yes, some have reached the light bulb moment. I certainly, for me, I was slow to turn on the light. It was like a dimmer switch gradually coming on. And but once it came on, I thought, well, I can't. Every new project I looked at, the very first thing I went to do, not the only thing, but the very first thing I would do would be to assess the size. And you can estimate it. There are a number of ways you can estimate it, but if you know the size and function points, you can assess the boundary of possibility in terms of schedule. So how long will this thing take? And you can be pretty confident of what has been done in the past. If you've got world-class developers, then you can deliver so many function points per month or per sprint. If you don't, you won't do that. And if that's what you need to do to get this done on time, you can predict right at the beginning whether or not you're going to get there. But knowing that's really powerful. So I took on a project once, and I think after a week, the sponsor came to me and he said, "Are we going to deliver this by whatever the date was?" And I said, "Well, it's getting close, but every time I attend a new meeting, I discover more scope in the project." 2 weeks later, I said to him, "No, we won't. It's going to take until the next, business scheduled opportunity to do it," which was a few months later. And I said, "But if the scope keeps increasing, it could take longer than that." And knowing the size was really, really useful, and it proved to be right. Knowing the size was really useful in being able to determine that. I mean, it's interesting, Rich, you mentioned about sizing infrastructure. So these days we have more and more infrastructure as code. You write a YAML file and it will determine what the server should look like. So that code, that script, can be measured in function points. It has a functional size. So as we start to embrace more and more scripting of infrastructure for clouds, we can look to size them that way, which is kind of an interesting twist, because functional sizing is designed to measure functionality of software.
Yeah.
I think what I've seen before, and I would love to get your guys' take on this, but it's almost within a team. There's kind of three things, right? There's the tooling, which I think is fine. There's ScopeMaster out there that can help you with this. There's the process. You can have it as part of your sprint planning, your scheduling. Even earlier than that, you can go out and do, your functional point planning, and you can get everything out of that. But I guess the one that's in the mix for me, which I've always found really challenging, and I've seen it challenging in organizations, is the people. You can sit down in a room and you can try and estimate how long someone thinks this is going to take. But then in reality, there's things like scope creep that can come in, which obviously increase the amount of time and effort that's in there. But also different people's ability to estimate the amount of effort it takes them is also very widely, it's very wide as well, right? Some people are very good at estimating that. Some people, it ends up taking double the amount of time. Some people actually underestimate their abilities and they end up doing it much faster. How do you adjust to that, Colin? Is that just a fact of over time you learn, how people estimate things, and you just apply a little coefficient to it? How do you get around that, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, estimation is a bit of a rabbit hole, and there's those that have strong views in all sorts of directions. But from a testing point of view, it's useful if you know the functional size. There's published metrics, benchmarks, on the defect potentials in requirements, code, design, architecture, and even the tests can have defects in them. There is also benchmarks for how many tests per function point do we expect to need to achieve a high level of quality, and what's our defect removal efficiency, and how many tests per function point do we need to achieve that, and how many layers of testing do we need to achieve that level of defect removal efficiency. And what I find is that, and I mean, your experience may well be quite different from this, but is that most testers are much more focused on what's in front of them rather than taking a broader quality
Yeah.
view of how do we get to a high quality product from an end to end. For example, I attended a testing conference once telling people about ScopeMaster, and every single tester and test manager said, I asked them, what is the quality of the requirements you get given? They all said, well, a bit iffy. And I said, as a quality person, are you responsible for ensuring that those requirements are of good quality? And the resounding answer was no. It was, oh, it's somebody else, or it's the
Yeah.
team, or it's the product
Yeah.
owner, or the BA. I said, well, how do you, and so there was this sort of disconnect there.
But I think what we're seeing in a lot of organizations now are people are starting to challenge who owns quality. And there's new roles appearing, right? Like VP of quality engineering, or there's like these new roles of being a quality engineer. And it is their job to go out and own this quality narrative across the whole software development lifecycle. So I think we are starting to see a shift now. And I think people are starting to appreciate that actually just going really fast and writing code and picking up requirements that aren't, have ambiguities in and trying to test them isn't working. So I think we are starting to see a shift, but yeah, there's so many organizations that are still struggling with that for sure. And we see it day to day.
I think the whole the whole function point element of that gives a degree of objective measure to that whole quality conversation. Elephant in the room. What does quality even mean, right? And
Yeah.
for those people picking up those quality roles, you got to make sure you're not being the scapegoat of the organization. To me, and this came, we went from the organization didn't really understand how to build platforms to actually having really, really good measures that you could tweak every single time you had a conveyor belt of repetition going on here where we refined it to the estimation point. We were refining the estimates to remove as much fudge factor as we could because we knew a lot about what we were doing, right? It was very repetitive in what we were doing. And so quality in that respect came very objective rather than just, SME
Yeah.
who kind of has a little silo, has a lot of head knowledge. They can say whatever they want, right? And how do you critique that? You can't. Whereas actually, if you follow this process, which is very logical, very visible in what's happening, there is the democratization of what quality means, right? There's
True.
transparency around what it is.
Yeah, there's some principles where maths is quite useful actually. There are some, but also there's some principles about software that haven't changed since software first emerged. Such as the functional size actually is as reliable predictor of the amount of effort it's going to take to deliver. But also with quality, if you develop something and you put one or two testers on it, but you're planning to expose it to hundreds of users, how many hours of testing before you find a defect is adequate? Because when you put it in front of users, what's going to happen? Well, there'll be hundreds of users or thousands or millions of users, and how quickly they may discover defects that you otherwise wouldn't have found.
Yeah,
So a really
Absolutely.
interesting question, which I think it's sort of it's as much a principle is how many hours of unique testing do you need to do before you find a defect that becomes acceptable for release. So, I mean, the benchmark that we've used for many years is 8 hours. If you do 8 hours of unique testing and find no serious defects, then your software may be good enough to release. Now, that may or may not be. I mean, with automation, of course, you can do a lot more faster. You can do, but it's the uniqueness of the testing. So it's not just repeating the same thing; it's doing things differently. I think people get so wrapped up in jargon and the latest trend and the latest fashion
yeah,
and forget to go back to the fundamentals, the principles. What's code doing? It's inputs, outputs, reads and writes. It has a size. It has a defect potential. We need to know what we're going to deliver for a user before we deliver it. The user has to be
yeah.
front and center of the experience. All these things are just like they're principles, and they haven't changed.
My exposure to the function point element was kind of fed through model-based testing, right? So it has a lot of the structure, the in-outs, the function pass. I'm assuming you're doing it through textual requirements, right? How does that work, and what challenges does it bring?
So what we do is we analyze the text looking for phraseology that infers inputs, outputs, reads and writes of an object by a user. So sort of these sort of these phrasing patterns of subject, verb and object. And a user story might have multiple functional steps. And with each functional step, there will be functional size interpreted from it. We see a huge range. So a user story might be as little as a single functional step, let's say a read. We're reading some data and showing it to a user. Bosh, that's 3 function points. Or it might be a really complex user story that involves multiple functional steps and can be 20 or more. And the highest anyone's observed as legitimate is around about 60 or 70 cosmic function points for a single, what we call functional user requirement or full user story. That's quite rare. It was actually in the finance sector. The average we see is 5.5 actually, cosmic function points per user story. But the challenges that we see, and this is where our quality inspection of the stories and the set of stories is quite useful, is that functionality either gets completely forgotten or omitted because it was at a high level, or gets buried in the acceptance criteria. So we just did an assessment for a company yesterday, and they had twice as much functionality that was legitimate to the user story, but it was buried in the acceptance criteria. Now, it's okay if you're doing early estimates and say, well, how big is this? Well, we know that we do that, right? We know that we bury 2/3 of our acceptance, 2/3 of the functionality in the acceptance criteria. So we should allow for that in our early estimates. Okay, so that's a kind of grown-up way of estimating the knowable unknowns or the some of the unknowns with early estimates. Once you do have that level of detail, you have to recognize, well, is the acceptance criteria functionality defined? Is it actually part of the user story or not? So that's one behavior that we see a lot of. And that's usually a sign of stories that may subsequently need to be split, or it's just that they are functionally large user stories. There are human nature is a bit of a challenge too, because human nature will say, well, I just want to be able to log in with my email address. Okay, that's whatever that is, 12 words. Okay, the login user story must be one of the most complex user stories for most systems. It can involve reading data from multiple directories, cross-referencing, checking whether it's been that person's been excluded.
LDAP, single sign-on.
All those things, LDAP, single sign-on, exactly.
Yeah.
All those things, and it's all part of the login story. And have they changed their password and their email address and so on? That kind of human nature of summarizing something and simplifying it is okay when you describe it as a capability, but you've got to think of that as a capability, not as the detailed user story, because ultimately you'll need to sort of know that functional detail.
So, Colin, what do you think then AI will do to requirements?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, I've been asked to give a few talks on this actually, and one thing that's for certain is that we're going through a period of amazing accelerated advancements in AI. I mean, I just learned this morning. So with software, knowing the context of what you're building is really important. Whether you're analyzing requirements to generate better requirements or more requirements or test cases, or if you're analyzing code or taking ideas and converting them into code, context really matters. Google has announced an increase from 32K tokens to 1 million tokens for context used to then assess what they've got in front of them and then make whatever generated outcomes are going to come from it. So that ability to increase the context size is a huge leap forward. We've got a long list of things where Language models will be interesting. And another advancement that's come out very recently is you can have your own proprietary generative AI. And I think, in the context of software development, there are many spaces. Can we use it to generate test scenarios? Can we use it to learn from previous work we've done, from other requirements we've got? Can we look at existing data models? Can we look at this existing behaviors to create better requirements, to suggest what the right architecture might be, to suggest what the testing regime should be? All this is possible. It's possible now.
Just following up from what you're saying there, Colin, if you look at what a lot of organizations are doing, or vendors like us, I suppose, it's all about talking about co-pilots rather than having some kind of autopilot. It's how can we augment what we're doing today? So it might be retrieving documents that exist in the organization to help us understand systems and ultimately understand requirements better, right? Or it might be coming through and saying, take this requirement and help me look for ambiguities and look for incompleteness.
In the right hands, doing the right thing, it can do amazing things really quickly. But this rush to say that every company is now an AI company will probably lead to either a lot of false starts or mistakes or just trying to automate the wrong thing. Once you delegate the decisions, or all the decisions, and you no longer have that supervisory role over what it's suggested, that's when troubling outcomes, I think, can happen. We've taken the philosophy with ScopeMaster, because it started its journey long before large language models were even available, is that it never changes your requirements. It only gives you feedback on how they might be interpreted. And we're really comfortable with that as our baseline position. Now we can enrich that and say, if you would like suggestions as to how to make this ambiguous requirement less ambiguous in the context of what you've already done, then press this button and here's a suggestion. But you own whether or not you embrace that suggestion. And the same could apply to test generation and other things. But that responsibility stays with the person responsible for the requirements.
Especially with the types of organizations that we work with together, right? Like it's all enterprises, it's B2B, and a lot of it is in regulated environments where having something going off like that and doing it on the fly, auto improving by itself, that's just not going to fly, right? There has to be some kind of gatekeeper there who is saying, this is what we think we could do. Should we do it?
I think it's interesting the point you made around context, right? And how do you get the AI the context of your organization? Because until you've done that, then I think your analogy of you've got a power tool in the hands of a layman, right? And they can do a lot of damage. But going back to the reality is that organizations that kind of skip in terms of doing requirements properly, or don't do designs, or have a lot of head knowledge, they've got a real problem to overcome if they want to adopt kind of a generative AI. And how are you going to give that LLM the context that essentially you haven't bothered capturing before? There's a real challenge there. Colin, have you got any last points that you just wanted to raise there? I saw you open your mouth very quickly.
No, it's I thoroughly enjoyed this. I could rabbit on for about this subject forever, but awesome. I thoroughly enjoyed sharing some thoughts with you guys today and listening to your view.
Many thanks for your time. I've learned more than cosmic function points than I ever thought I'd know. So thank you for that, and big thank you to James for being the co-host with me today. And again, a big thanks to Colin for being our guest on the pod.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Why Didn't You Test That podcast. To continue the conversation, head over to curiositysoftware.ie. And don't forget to subscribe for more episodes.